Have you ever tried to have a rational argument with a child? You present facts, you use logic, you explain cause and effect. And what happens? The child ignores everything you said, throws a tantrum, changes the subject, or just starts crying until they get their way. That's what it's like to argue with a Democrat. That's what it's like trying to have a conversation with the modern left about politics, economics, history, or, just really anything that requires adult reasoning. They act like children, spoiled, entitled, emotionally unstable children who've never had to face real consequences for their actions or their beliefs. And I'm done pretending this is normal political disagreement. This isn't a difference of opinion between mature adults who see the world differently. This is the difference between people who've grown up and accepted reality and people who are still living in a fantasy world where they think they can wish away basic truths about human nature and economics. There's an old saying, often attributed to Winston Churchill. If you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 40, you have no brain. And while I don't entirely agree with the first part, plenty of young people have the sense to be conservative. The second part is absolutely true. Conservatism is what you arrive at when you grow up. When you get a job and see how much the government takes from your paycheck. When you start a business and deal with regulations and bureaucracy. When you buy property and realize you're paying taxes on something you supposedly own. When you have kids and see what garbage the schools are teaching them. That's when reality hits you. That's when you realize that the utopian promises of the left are lies. That's when you understand that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. That's when you grow up. Democrats haven't grown up. They're still living in the idealistic fantasy of their college years, where every problem has a government solution, and anyone who disagrees is evil. They're still believing what their professors told them and what the media feeds them, because they've never developed the critical thinking skills to question authority when that authority tells them what they want to hear. This episode is about why Democrats act like children, what causes this permanent state of immaturity, and what it takes for someone to finally grow up and join the real world. And I'm not going to be gentle about it. I'm going to try not to scream. Because these people are running the country into the ground with their childish ideology. And it's time someone told them the truth.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
Let's start with the most obvious childish behavior, the tantrum. When you present facts that contradict what Democrats believe, when you challenge their worldview with evidence and logic, what's their response? They don't engage with your argument. They don't present counter evidence. They don't have a rational discussion about the merits of different positions. They have a tantrum. They get emotional. They call you names. They accuse you of being racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or whatever other label they think will shut down the conversation. They act like you have personally attacked them by disagreeing with their political beliefs. This is exactly how children behave when they don't get their way. They can't handle the frustration of being told no. They can't process the reality that the world doesn't conform to their desires. So they melt down and try to make the situation so unpleasant that the adult gives in just to make it stop. Democrats have weaponized the tantrum. They've turned emotional outbursts into a political strategy. Cry racism loudly enough and your opponent backs down. Claim you feel unsafe and the university cancels the speaker. Accuse someone of bigotry and they lose their job. It works because adults want to avoid conflict. We want to be reasonable. We want to find common ground. And children learn very early that exploiting that desire for peace is an effective way to get what they want. But here's the thing about tantrums. They don't actually prove anything. A child screaming that they want ice cream for dinner doesn't make ice cream a nutritious meal. The volume and intensity of the emotional reaction has no bearing on whether the underlying claim is true. Democrats act like emotional intensity equals moral authority. If they're upset enough, if they cry hard enough, if they express enough outrage, they think that proves they're right. It doesn't. It just proves they're emotional. And emotional reasoning is how children think, not adults. Let me give you some specific examples. Try having a conversation with a Democrat about illegal immigration. Present the facts. We have laws that govern who can enter the country. Those laws exist in every nation. Enforcing those laws is not racism. It's basic sovereignty. What's the response? You just hate brown people. You want to separate families. You're a fascist. No engagement with the actual argument. No discussion of why laws should or shouldn't be enforced. Just immediate escalation to emotional accusations designed to make you the bad guy for holding a completely reasonable position. Try discussing economics. Explain that raising the minimum wage causes unemployment among low-skilled workers. Point to economic studies. Reference basic supply and demand principles. What's the response? You don't care about poor people. You want people to starve. You're a greedy capitalist who only cares about profits. Again, no engagement with the economics. No discussion of trade-offs or unintended consequences. Just emotional accusations that you're a bad person for understanding how labor markets work. Try talking about crime and policing. Explain that most crime happens in specific neighborhoods and that police presence reduces that crime. Point to statistics showing that the communities most affected by crimes are the ones most harmed when police pull back. What's the response for that? You support police brutality. You don't care about black lives. You're a racist. No discussion of how to actually reduce crime. No engagement with the data, just emotional outbursts designed to shut down the conversation. This pattern repeats on every single issue. Climate change, education, healthcare, foreign policy, it doesn't matter. If you disagree with the Democrat position, you're not wrong. You're evil. And they respond with the emotional intensity of a child being told they can't have what they want. The reason this is so frustrating is that you can't have a rational discussion with someone who responds to facts with feelings. You can't find common ground with someone who thinks disagreement equals hatred. You can't solve problems with someone who won't acknowledge that problems involve trade-offs rather than simple solutions. This is why political discourse is broken down. It's not because there's genuine disagreements between people of good faith. It's because one side has abandoned rational discourse in favor of emotional manipulation. Democrats have learned that throwing tantrums works. Universities cave to their demands, corporations change policies to avoid their outrage, politicians apologize and back down rather than standing firm. So they keep doing it. Why wouldn't they? It's effective. And just like a child who learns that tantrums get results, they have no incentive to develop more mature methods of engagement. But here's what they don't understand. The rest of us are getting tired of it. We're tired of being called names for holding reasonable positions. We're tired of the emotional manipulation substituting for argument. We're tired of treating grown adults like they're fragile children who need to be protected from disagreement. The tantrum strategy is losing its effectiveness. More and more people are refusing to back down when Democrats start screaming. More people are recognizing that emotional intensity doesn't equal moral authority. More people are demanding actual arguments instead of accepting accusations as substitute for reason. And the Democrats don't know what to do when tantrums stop working, because they have never developed the skills to engage in actual debate. They never learned how to present evidence, address counterarguments, or acknowledge complexity. They learned to cry until they got their way. And now that the crying isn't working anymore, they're lost. This is what happens when you never grow up. When you never develop the emotional regulation and rational thinking skills that adults need. You're left with nothing but tantrums and outrage, and eventually, people stop taking you seriously. The second major way Democrats act like children is their complete dependence on authority figures to tell them what to think. They're sheep. They follow whatever the media says, whatever their political leaders say, whatever their professors taught them, without ever questioning whether it's actually true. Children are naturally dependent on authority. They have to be. They don't have the knowledge or experience to navigate the world on their own. So they trust parents, teachers, and other adults to guide them. But adults are supposed to develop critical thinking skills. We're supposed to learn how to evaluate information, question claims, and think for ourselves. We're supposed to be able to disagree with authority when authority is wrong. Democrats never made that transition. They're still in the mindset where authority figures are always right, as long as those authority figures are saying the things that they want to hear. The media tells them that Trump is a fascist. They believe it without question. Never mind that Trump was already president for 4 years and didn't do anything fascist. Never mind that the accusation is obviously absurd to anyone who knows what actual fascism looks like. The media said it, so it must be true. Their professors tell them that America is built on systemic racism. They believe it without question. Never mind that America has made more progress on racial equality than virtually any other diverse society in history. Never mind that the claim requires ignoring all evidence of progress and all examples of non-white success. The professor said it, so it must be true. Democratic politicians tell them that socialism will work this time. They believe it without question. Never mind that socialism has failed every single time it's been tried. Never mind the economic principles that explain why it can't work. Never mind the millions of people killed by socialist regimes. The politicians said it would work, so it must be true. This is the sheep mentality. Following the herd without thinking. Accepting whatever you're told by people you see as on your side. Never questioning the narrative, because questioning might mean you're not part of the group anymore. And just like sheep, Democrats are easily herded in whatever directions their leaders want them to go. One day, they're told to care about Russia collusion, so they care about Russia collusion. Then they're told to care about impeachment, so they care about impeachment. Then they're told to care about January 6th, so they care about January 6th. They don't think about whether these issues actually matter or whether the narrative they're being fed is accurate. They just follow along because that's what the herd is doing. This is fundamentally childish. It's the mentality of a kid who believes everything their parents tell them without question. It's the mentality of a student who memorizes what the teacher says for the test without ever thinking about whether it's actually true. Adults are supposed to outgrow this. We're supposed to develop the confidence and independence to think for ourselves, even when that means disagreeing with people we respect or people who claim authority. But Democrats are trapped in this dependent mind state. And it's not by accident. The left actively encourages this dependency. Look at how they talk about government. It's always framed as the parent and citizens as children who need to be taken care of. The government will give you health care. The government will give you education. The government will give you a job. The government will protect you from everything scary in the world. This is literally the language of parent and child. And Democrats eat it up because they want to be taken care of. They don't want the responsibility of being independent adults who have to make their own decisions or make their own way in the world. They want someone else to solve their problems, someone else to make the hard decisions, someone else to be responsible when things go wrong. That's why they're comfortable with ever-expanding government control. They're not scared of tyranny because they see the government as a benevolent parent who only wants what's best for them. They can't imagine that the authority they trust so completely might have other motives or might be wrong. This is also why they're so susceptible to propaganda. When you never develop critical thinking skills, when you never learn to question what you're told, you'll believe anything that comes from a source you trust. The media has figured this out. They know that if they present information with the right emotional framing, if they get the right authority figures to repeat it, Democrats will believe it without investigation. That's how you get situations where Democrats believe things that are demonstrably false. Russia collusion, the fine people hoax, the idea that Republicans want to ban contraception, the claim that voter ID laws are racist. All of these are easily debunked with minimal research, but Democrats believe them because trusted sources told them to. This sheep mentality also explains why Democrats are so terrible at handling cognitive dissonance. When reality contradicts what they've been told to believe, they can't process it. They can't adjust their worldview based on new evidence because their worldview isn't based on evidence. It's based on what authority figures told them. So instead of updating their beliefs when they're faced with contradictory information, they either ignore the information or they attack the source. They call it misinformation. They claim it's right-wing propaganda. They do whatever mental gymnastics necessary to avoid having to question what they've been told. This is the opposite of intellectual maturity. Mature adults can handle being wrong. We can update our beliefs when we learn new information. We can acknowledge complexity and uncertainty. Children can't do this. Their understanding of the world is rigid and dependent on what trusted adults tell them. They can't handle having their worldview challenged because they don't have the cognitive tools to rebuild it. Democrats are stuck in this childish mindset. They're dependent on authority figures to tell them what to think. They're uncomfortable with independent thought. They're scared of being cast out of the group if they question the narrative. And the left exploits this dependency ruthlessly. They create echo chambers where only approved information reaches their followers. They punish dissent and reward conformity. They make sure that Democrats never have to develop the critical thinking skills that would allow them to break free from the herd. This is why it's so hard to reach Democrats with facts and logic. You're not just asking them to change their mind on one issue. You're asking them to fundamentally rethink their relationship with authority. You're asking them to become independent thinkers instead of dependent followers. That's a terrifying prospect for someone who's built their entire identity around trusting the right people and believing the right things. It's easier just to call you a liar and go back to the safety of the herd. But this dependency comes with a cost. When you never learn to think for yourself, you're vulnerable to manipulation. You're vulnerable to being used by people who don't have your best interest at heart. You're vulnerable to supporting policies that harm you because you've never developed the ability to recognize when you're being lied to. The sheep mentality is comfortable, but it's not freedom, and it's not adulthood. Here's the fundamental reason why people grow up and become conservative. They get skin in the game. They start having something to lose. And once you have something to lose, you start paying attention to reality instead of living in idealistic fantasies. This is the third major way Democrats are like children. They don't have skin in the game. They're living off someone else's labor, someone else's resources, someone else's success. And because they're not bearing the real costs of their beliefs, they never have to confront how wrong those beliefs are. Think about actual children. They can demand ice cream for every meal because they're not the ones dealing with the health consequences. They can demand expensive toys because they're not the ones who have to earn the money. They can make all kinds of unreasonable demands because someone else is bearing the cost. Democrats do the same thing. They demand free college because they're not the ones who have to figure out how to pay for it. They demand open borders because they're not the ones whose wages get undercut by illegal labor. They demand defunding the police because they live in safe neighborhoods with private security. Someone else always bears the cost of their idealism. And because they never face consequences themselves, they never have to adjust their beliefs to match reality. Let me walk you through how this works in practice. Young people tend to be liberal because they don't have any skin in the game yet. They're in college or they're just starting out. They're not paying much in taxes. They don't own any property. They don't have kids. They don't run businesses. They're not responsible for much beyond themselves. In that situation, it's easy to be idealistic. It's easy to believe in socialism because you haven't worked hard to build something only to have the government take it away. It's easy to support open borders because you haven't seen how it affects wages and the housing costs. It's easy to trust government because you haven't dealt with bureaucracy destroying your business with regulations. But then something happens. You get your first real job and see how much gets taken out of your paycheck for taxes. You start thinking about what you could do with that money if you got to keep it. You start questioning whether the government is really spending your money wisely. That's the first moment of growing up. When you realize that the government spending isn't free, that every program is funded by taking money from people who earned it, that you're one of the people being taken from. Then you try to start a business. You have a good idea. You're willing to work hard. You're excited to build something. And then you run into the regulatory nightmare. The permits, the fees, the compliance requirements, the paperwork, the arbitrary rules that make no sense but have to be followed anyway. The government officials who have the power to destroy your business for not filling out a form correctly. That's the second moment of growing up, when you realize that the government isn't here to help you, that bureaucracy exists to justify itself, not to serve the public. That the people making the rules about your business, have never run a business, and don't understand what they're regulating. Then you buy a house. You save up for it for years. You make sacrifices. You finally have this piece of property that's yours. And then you get the property tax bill. You realize you don't actually own this property. You're renting it from the government. If you don't pay your property tax, they'll take your house. You can pay off your mortgage completely, and you still owe the government money every year just for the privilege of living in the property you supposedly own. That's the third moment of growing up. When you realize that property rights are conditional, that the government claims ownership over everything, that you're never really free of their demands. Then you have kids. You want what's best for them. You want them to get a good education, to learn critical thinking, to be prepared for adult life. And then you see what the schools are teaching. The propaganda, the ideology, the refusal to teach basic skills like math and reading in favor of social justice indoctrination. The complete absence of American history and civics. The explicit messaging that America is evil and your children should be ashamed of their country. That's the fourth moment of growing up. When you realize that the educational establishment doesn't share your values, that they're actively working to undermine what you're trying to teach your children at home, that you can't trust the institutions you're forced to send your children to. Each of these moments forces you to confront reality, forces you to see that the idealistic promises of the left don't match how the world actually works, forces you to recognize that there are trade-offs, that nothing is free, that the government is not benevolent, that institutions cannot be trusted. And each of these moments pushes you toward conservatism. Because conservatism is what you arrive at when you understand reality. When you've seen how government actually operates. When you've felt the weight of taxation and regulation. When you've had to make hard choices with your own money and your own time. Democrats avoid these moments of growth. They structure their lives to avoid getting skin in the game. They work for universities or nonprofits or government agencies where they're insulated from market forces. They live in cities where other people's taxes subsidize their infrastructure. They don't have kids, or if they do, they send them to private schools while advocating for public school policies that harm everyone else's children. They have enough money to avoid the consequences of the policies they support. When crime rises, they move to a safer neighborhood. When schools fail, they pay for private education. When their city becomes unlivable, they relocate and vote for the same policies somewhere else. They never have to face the reality that their beliefs are wrong because they're never the ones bearing the cost. Someone else always pays the price for their idealism. This is fundamentally childish. It's the mentality of someone who's never had to be responsible for the consequences of their choices. Someone who's always had someone else to clean up their messes. Adults understand cause and effect. We understand that choices have consequences. We understand that you can't just demand what you want without considering who's going to pay for it or what trade-offs are involved. But you only learn those lessons through experience, through having skin in the game, through facing consequences yourself, rather than imposing them on others. And that's the fundamental divide between conservatives and Democrats. Conservatives have grown up. We've faced reality. We've had to make the hard choices and live with the results. Democrats are still living in the fantasy where you can have everything you want without trade-offs, where government can solve all problems, where disagreement means the other person is evil. They're children, and they'll stay children until they finally get skin in the game and have to confront how wrong they've been. I know what you're asking yourself now. You're saying, so, Philly, what does it take for Democrats to finally grow up? Well, what's the reality check that breaks through the indoctrination and forces them to confront the real world? I think it's different for everyone, but I do believe that there's common patterns, common experiences, if you will, that snap people out of the leftist fantasy and into adult thinking. For a lot of people, it's crime. They live in a liberal city. They vote for progressive prosecutors and defund the police initiatives. They believe the narrative that police are the problem and that crime is just a result of poverty and racism. And they get victimized. Their car gets broken into. Their apartment gets burglarized. They get assaulted on the street. Someone they love becomes a victim of violent crime. Suddenly, the abstract politics becomes very real. Suddenly, they understand why law enforcement matters. Suddenly, they realize that the people committing crimes aren't just misunderstood victims of systematic injustice. They're predators who will hurt you given the opportunity. That's the brutal reality check. But it works. I've seen more people convert from liberal to conservative over crime than almost any other issue. Because once you've been a victim, once you've experienced the consequences of soft on crime policies, you can't go back to the fantasy. For others, it's taxation. They get their first real job, making decent money. They're excited to finally be able to be financially stable. And then they see the tax bill. Federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security, Medicare, sales tax, property tax, all of it adding up to the government taking 40 or 50% of what you earn. And you start asking questions. What are they doing with all this money? Why is this necessary? Why should I work harder if they're just going to take more? That's when people start understanding the conservative position on taxation. Not because they're greedy or selfish, but because they finally experienced what it feels like to have the government confiscate half of your earnings. For others, it's starting a business. They have entrepreneurial ambitions. They want to build something. They believe in the American dream. And then they experience the regulatory state, the permits, the licenses, the inspections, the arbitrary rules, the bureaucrats who have the power to destroy what you've built over technicalities. Suddenly, you understand why conservatives oppose regulation. Suddenly, you realize that government isn't here to help small businesses. It's here to extract revenue and justify its own existence. For others, it's having kids. They become parents, and suddenly, they're responsible for another human being. They want their kids to succeed. They want them to be safe, educated, and prepared for life. And then they see what the schools are teaching. They attend a school board meeting and hear the crazy ideology being pushed on children. They review the curriculum and see that their kids are learning political propaganda instead of basic skills. Suddenly you understand why conservatives care about education. Suddenly you realize that people running these institutions don't have your children's best interests at heart. For others, it's experiencing the consequences of immigration policy. They live in an area that gets flooded with illegal immigrants. They see wages stagnate as employers hire cheap illegal labor. They see housing costs rise as demand increases. They see crime increase. They see their kids' schools struggle to accommodate students who don't speak English. Suddenly, you understand why conservatives want border enforcement. Suddenly, you realize that immigration policy has real consequences for real people, and that those consequences aren't evenly distributed. All of these reality checks have something in common. They force you to confront the gap between leftist rhetoric and actual outcomes. They make you face the consequences of policies you might have supported when they were just abstract ideas. Once you've faced those consequences, once you've seen how the real world actually works, you can't go back to the fantasy. You can't pretend that government is benevolent. You can't pretend that people are basically good and just need the right environment. You can't pretend that every problem has a solution if we just care enough. You've grown up. You've joined reality. And reality has a conservative bias. This is why Democrats fight so hard to keep people in their bubble. They know that exposure to reality is the biggest threat to their ideology. They know that once people get skin in the game, once they experience the consequences of leftist policies, they start asking questions. So they confront the information environment. They dominate education so young people are indoctrinated before they have real-world experience. They control media so people only hear approved narratives. They create social pressure so anyone who questions the ideology gets ostracized. They're trying to prevent people from growing up because they know that grown-ups don't stay Democrats. But reality always wins eventually. You can delay the reality check. You can try to insulate people from consequences. You can create elaborate systems to prevent exposure to opposing viewpoints, but eventually, reality breaks through. Eventually, people have experiences that contradict what they've been told. Eventually, they have to choose between the comfortable fantasy and the uncomfortable truth. And more, people are choosing truth. They're walking away from the Democratic Party. They're rejecting the media narrative. They're questioning the ideology they were taught. They're growing up. And once you've grown up, once you've accepted reality, you realize how insane it is that we let children run our institutions and set our policies. Democrats act like children because they are children. They're emotionally immature adults who never develop the critical thinking skills, emotional regulation, or real-world experience necessary to function as independent adults. They throw tantrums when they don't get their way. They blindly follow authority figures who tell them what they want to hear. They demand things without consideration for who's going to pay for them or what trade-offs are involved. They're sheep being led by people who exploit their dependency and immaturity for political power, and they're content to stay that way because growing up is hard and uncomfortable. But the reality check always comes eventually. Crime, taxation, regulation, education, immigration, something eventually forces you to confront the gap between leftist promises and actual outcomes. And when that happens, when you finally face reality, you have a choice. You can retreat back into the comfortable fantasy, surround yourself with people who will protect you from uncomfortable truths and stay a child forever. Or you can grow up. You can accept that the world is complicated, that there are no perfect solutions, that you have to make hard choices and live with the trade-offs. You can develop the strength to think for yourself, even when it means disagreeing with people you respect. Conservatism is what you arrive at when you choose to grow up. When you choose reality over fantasy. When you choose independence over dependency. I'm not expecting mass conversions. Most Democrats will stay in their bubble, protected from reality by the institutions and media that profit from their immaturity. But for those who are ready to grow up, who are tired of being treated like children, who want to live in the real world instead of the fantasy, conservatism is waiting. Reality is waiting. All you have to do is open your eyes and start thinking for yourself. Check out Truth in the Darkness at titdusa.com for media that treats you like an adult, that respects your intelligence, that doesn't try to manipulate you with emotional appeals and propaganda. We're building an alternative to the childish left-wing media machine. Grow up, face reality, think for yourselves. I'll see you next time.